She hadn't moved a single step, frozen on the boardwalk, watching the man who destroyed her, smiling, happy, with another woman on his arm. Then a stranger leaned in close and said 4 quiet words, and her whole world shifted. What he did next? Nobody saw it coming, not even her. This story is a gentle reminder that the door that closes on you in heartbreak is often the very same one that opens into the life you were always meant to live. This channel is your home for stories from the heart of the Old West, of cowboys with quiet courage, love that rises from the ashes of heartbreak, and the beautiful things that happen when one stranger chooses to be kind. If this story warmed your heart, hit that like button, leave a comment with your favorite moment, share it with someone who needs a little hope, and subscribe so you never miss a story worth staying for. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons.
The dust on Main Street had barely settled when Bethany Zimmerman laid eyes on the couple getting out of the stagecoach, and her heart just plumb forgot how to beat. It had been 3 long years since Thomas Whitmore had called the whole thing off just 2 weeks before their wedding, saying he was heading to California to find himself. And now, here he was, standing right there in Oregon City, with some dainty little blonde thing on his arm. Her silk dress was glinting in the hard August sun of 1876. Bethany's fingers clenched the handle of her supply basket, her knuckles turning bone white as she watched Thomas help his new wife down from the coach. He was so gentle and careful with her, a way he had never been with Bethany. She knew she ought to have spun right around, ducked back inside the general store, or slipped into the alley, but her boots felt like they were nailed clean through the boardwalk. The September heat was a heavy blanket on her shoulders, making her simple calico dress stick right to her back. She had worked herself to the bone rebuilding her life after Thomas took off. She took over her father's seamstress shop after he passed on last winter, and she had earned the town's respect with nothing but grit and a sharp needle. Now all of that felt like it might just crumble into dust, all because she could not get her legs to move. Thomas had not seen her yet. He was laughing at something his wife whispered, his head tilted back with a joy that was all too real. And just like that, Bethany felt that old hurt tear wide open, fresh and raw as the day it happened. She thought she had loved him once upon a time. But more than love, she felt the deep down shame of being left, of being the woman who was not good enough, not exciting enough, not worth keeping. "You planning on standing there all day, or are you going to move before that basket cuts the feeling clean out of your hands?" The voice came from right behind her, low and warm, with a friendly tease to it. Bethany jumped so hard she nearly sent her supplies scattering everywhere. She whirled around and found herself looking way up at a tall fella in worn denim and a brown leather vest. His dark hair was a little too long under a dusty hat, and his eyes were the color of good Tennessee whiskey in the sun. She had seen him around town some over the past month, a man who mostly kept to himself, but they had never spoken a word. "I am so sorry." "I was just," she started, but the words dried up in her throat when Thomas's voice boomed across the street. Bethany Zimmerman, is that really you?" The cowboy's eyes flickered from her face to the couple now making their way across the dusty street, and a look of sharp understanding crossed his face. Before Bethany could figure out what to do or what to say, the stranger moved a little closer. His presence was suddenly solid and steady behind her, a silent guard at her back. "Friend of yours?" he asked, his voice low, though she had a feeling he already knew the answer. "Not quite," she managed to whisper back, her throat tight with a mix of a dozen different feelings. Thomas reached them, his wife still holding onto his arm. Up close, Bethany could see he was doing well for himself. His suit was well made and looked expensive, and his boots were polished to a mirror shine. His wife was even prettier than she looked from far away, with eyes the color of blue cornflowers and perfect pink lips turned up in a curious smile. "Bethany, I just cannot believe it. What are the odds?" Thomas said, acting genuinely happy to see her. "You look good. Town life seems to suit you." "I'm doing just fine," Bethany said, fighting to keep her voice even. I am running my father's shop now. Oh, that is right. I did hear about your father. I am sorry for your loss. Thomas's face changed to something that was supposed to look like sympathy, but it felt hollow. This is my wife, Eleanor. We have been married for just over 2 years now. We met out in San Francisco. What a city that is. Nothing at all like this little frontier town, I can tell you that. Eleanor held out a gloved hand with a practiced sort of grace. It is so lovely to finally meet you, Miss Zimmerman. Any friend of Thomas's is a friend of mine. The words were polite enough, but they stung like salt in a fresh wound. Bethany took her hand for a moment. Her own fingers felt rough and calloused from her work next to Eleanor's softness. She could still feel the cowboy standing right there behind her, a quiet strength that somehow made her feel a little less alone. "What brings you back to Oregon City?" Bethany asked, though what she really wanted to ask was why in the world he thought she would ever want to lay eyes on him again. "Business, as a matter of fact," Thomas said, puffing out his chest a little bit. "I have done pretty well for myself in the shipping business, and I'm looking to bring my work up to the Oregon Territory. We will be in town for a few weeks while I meet with some folks and look at the opportunities." A few weeks. The words hit Bethany like a punch to the gut. She figured this would be a quick, awful run-in that she could survive and forget about. But the thought of seeing Thomas and his perfect wife all over town for weeks on end, having to smile and act like it did not bother her one bit, well, that just felt like an impossible task. "That sounds very impressive," she said, but her voice came out quiet and small. "I certainly hope you find what you are looking for." "We ought to have dinner together while we are here," Thomas suggested, completely blind to the way all the color had drained from Bethany's face. "Catch up on old times. I would love to hear all about what you have been doing these past few years, and I'm sure Eleanor would love to have someone who actually lives here show her around." "I believe Miss Zimmerman might already have plans for her evenings," the cowboy said, his voice cutting through Thomas's chatter with a quiet power, "seeing as how we have plans most nights." Bethany's head snapped around to stare at him, but his face was calm and easy, though his eyes threw down a challenge as he looked at Thomas. The stranger shifted just a bit, and his hand rested lightly on the small of her back. The touch was proper, but it was also clear as day what he meant by it. Thomas's eyebrows shot up, his eyes darting between Bethany and the cowboy, completely surprised. "Oh, I did not realize you were seeing someone." "This is Quinn Dalton," Bethany said, her mind scrambling to keep up with what was happening. "He is." "We are getting acquainted," Quinn finished for her. "Smooth as you please," his hand still resting on her back. "And I am afraid I keep her pretty occupied, but I am sure you two will see her around town during your stay. Oregon City is not that big of a place." Eleanor was watching the whole thing with sharp eyes, and Bethany had to wonder if she could see right through the lie, if she knew that she and Quinn had never said more than a polite howdy to each other before this very minute. But Eleanor's smile never faded, and she gave Thomas's arm a gentle squeeze. "Of course, we understand completely," Eleanor said with real warmth. "It was a pleasure to meet you both. I'm sure we will see you around." Thomas looked like he had more to say, his face a mix of confusion and maybe a little annoyance that Bethany was not just free to be his personal guide around the town he had walked out on. But Eleanor was already leading him away, saying something about finding their hotel. In just a few moments, they were gone, vanishing down the boardwalk. Bethany stood there, frozen solid, for what felt like a lifetime after they left, her heart pounding so loud she could hear it drumming in her ears. Then Quinn's hand lifted from her back, and the feeling of it being gone broke whatever spell had her rooted to the spot. She turned to face him, not sure if she should thank him or ask him just what in the Sam Hill he thought he was doing. "I beg your pardon if I spoke out of turn," Quinn said before she could get a word out. He pushed his hat back a little so she could see his face better. "But you looked like you were about to shatter into a million little pieces, and I had a hunch you did not really want to have supper with that pair." "You had a correct hunch?" Bethany admitted, finally letting out a shaky breath. He was the man you were once engaged to, I take it, judging by the look on your face when you saw him." It was not really a question, but Bethany nodded anyway. "He left me 3 years ago, called off our wedding right before it was supposed to happen. I had no idea he had gotten married. and I sure did not expect him to ever come back here." Quinn's face hardened a little, and a flash of anger crossed his eyes. "Well, that takes a special brand of fool, leaving a woman like you and then waltzing back in here expecting a welcome party." The simple compliment, said so casually without asking for anything in return, sent a warmth spreading through Bethany's chest. "Thank you for stepping in. I do not think I could have made it through a dinner with them." "You do not owe that man a single thing. Not your time and not your attention," Quinn said, his voice firm. Then his face turned a little sheepish. "Although I might have made things a bit complicated by saying we were courting. If that causes you any trouble, I truly am sorry." "No, actually, it might just make the next few weeks bearable," Bethany said slowly, the idea forming in her head as she said the words. "If they believe I'm seeing someone, Thomas might just leave me be instead of trying to patch up some kind of friendship I have no interest in." Quinn looked at her for a long moment, his smart eyes seeming to understand more than she was saying out loud. "Are you suggesting we ought to pretend we are courting, keep this little show going while they are in town?" "Would you be willing to do that?" Bethany asked, and she could hear the hope in her own voice and did not even care. "I know it is a mighty strange thing to ask, and we do not even know each other, but I cannot handle them on my own. I just cannot take weeks of being pitied or sized up against his perfect new wife." Quinn spoke softly, and the honesty in his voice made Bethany's breath catch. "You would not be the one who comes up short in any of that. And yes, I am willing to help you out. It just feels like the decent thing to do." A wave of relief washed over Bethany, so strong that her eyes began to sting with tears. "Thank you, I mean it. I will find a way to make it up to you, I promise. I could cook you meals or mend your clothes." "How about we just call it helping each other out?" Quinn interrupted in a gentle voice. "No payment necessary. Sometimes a person just needs to know someone is on their side." They just stood there on the boardwalk with the afternoon sun warming their faces and the sounds of the town buzzing around them. And Bethany felt a little shift deep inside her chest. This complete stranger had stepped up to defend her for no good reason at all, offering her a lifeline and asking for nothing. Suddenly she wanted to know every single thing about him. "I suppose I should know a little more about you if we expect folks to believe we are actually courting," she said, trying to bring a little bit of common sense into the moment. "Where are you from? What kind of work do you do?" The corners of Quinn's mouth turned up in what was almost a real smile. "I am a horse wrangler for the most part. I have been moving around the territory, breaking horses for ranchers and helping out with cattle drives. I rode into town about a month ago and have just been picking up odd jobs while I try to decide on my next move." "What made you choose Oregon City?" Bethany asked, her curiosity now fully awake. "I heard the land was good out here." "The weather is a whole lot better than some other places I have been," Quinn said with a small shrug of his shoulders. "I have been thinking about settling down somewhere, maybe even starting my own ranch, if I can manage to save up enough money. I am 25. I figure it is about time to put down some roots instead of just drifting around." Bethany felt herself start to unwind a little. He was close to her own age of 23, not some grizzled old cowboy or a wild young troublemaker. There was a certain steadiness about him, something solid and dependable in the way he carried himself. "I live right above the seamstress shop on 3rd Street, she told him. "I took over my father's business after he passed away. It is not a whole lot, but it keeps a roof over my head and food on my table." "Running your own business at 23, Quinn said, and his voice was full of respect. "That is mighty impressive. No one had ever called her impressive before. Practical, sure, and hard-working, absolutely. But impressive was a new one, and Bethany discovered that she really liked the sound of it. "We should probably make sure we are seen together around town if we want anyone to believe this," she said, her practical side taking over. "Again, maybe you could walk me home. My shop is not very far from here." "I would be glad to," Quinn said. And this time his smile was big and real, and it changed his face from just handsome to something that made Bethany's heart beat a little faster. He offered her his arm with a touch of old-fashioned politeness, and after just a second of hesitation, she took it. They strolled down Main Street together, and Bethany was keenly aware of the curious looks they got from the townspeople. Quinn Dalton had mostly kept to himself since he arrived in Oregon City. Not unfriendly, but not exactly sociable either. Seeing him with the town's most eligible seamstress was bound to get the gossips talking. But for the first time in a long while, Bethany did not mind being the topic of conversation. Let them talk. Let Thomas get wind that she had moved on, that she had found someone who actually wanted to be seen in public with her. "Tell me something real about you," Quinn said as they made the turn onto 3rd Street. "Something more than just the facts." The question caught her by surprise, and Bethany had to take a moment to think about it. "I hate sewing," she finally admitted. "I am good at it, and I need the money, but I do not have the love for it that my father did. The thing I really enjoy is reading. I have a whole shelf full of books in my rooms, and sometimes I will stay up way too late, just because I cannot bear to put a story down." "What kind of books do you read?" Quinn asked, and he sounded like he really wanted to know. "Adventure stories, mostly. Novels about people who explore new lands and have all kinds of exciting experiences. It is probably silly, I guess, reading about big adventures while I am living such a quiet life." "It is not silly at all," Quinn said with firmness in his voice. "Everybody needs an escape every now and then, and who is to say your life will always be quiet?" They arrived at the seamstress shop, a tidy little building with clean windows that showed off some of Bethany's handiwork. She reluctantly dropped her hand from Quinn's arm, not quite ready for their time to be over, but not sure how to ask him to stay. "Thank you again for everything today," she said. "You really saved me from a truly awful situation. Like I told you, it just seemed like the decent thing to do." Quinn tipped his hat to her, and the gesture felt both respectful and personal all at once. "I will stop by tomorrow if that is all right with you. Maybe we could take another walk, let folks see us out together again." "I would like that very much," Bethany said, and she meant it more than she ever would have guessed. She stood there and watched him walk down the street, his stride long and easy and sure, and she wondered what in the world she had gotten herself into. This was supposed to be a simple plan, just a way to protect herself from Thomas's unwanted attention and the pity from all the townspeople who remembered her public humiliation. But there was something about Quinn Dalton that made her feel things she had not felt in years, that made her want things she had convinced herself she did not need anymore. The next morning came up clear and warm, just another beautiful day in a long line of them that late summer. Bethany opened her shop at 8 o'clock just like always, but she found it hard to focus, her eyes wandering to the street through her window more than they stayed on the dress she was supposed to be hemming. Would Quinn really show up? Or had he changed his mind overnight? Maybe the whole thing was just a moment of gallantry that he was now regretting. But at 10 o'clock, right when she was starting to accept her disappointment, the shop door swung open and in walked Quinn. He had cleaned himself up from the day before. His shirt was fresh and his hair was still a little damp, as if he had just ducked his head in a water barrel. He held his hat in his hands and looked a bit out of place standing there among all the fabrics and dress forms. He was so clearly out of his element that Bethany had to stop herself from smiling. "Morning," he said. "I sure hope I'm not bothering you while you are working." "Not at all," Bethany promised him, putting the dress aside and wiping her hands on her apron. "I was hoping you would come by." "Told you I would," Quinn said simply, as if keeping his promise was the most natural thing in the whole world. They walked through town together, taking the long way around past the church and the schoolhouse, and then past the saloon and the bank. Bethany kept up a steady stream of chatter, pointing out different buildings, and telling Quinn about the people they saw. Mrs. Henderson, the woman who ran the boarding house, always had something to say about everyone else's business. Mr. Chen, who owned the laundry, made the very best dumplings Bethany had ever eaten, the deputy. Marshall was trying to court the preacher's daughter, even though her father did not approve. Quinn was more of a listener than a talker, but when he did say something, his comments were clever and often made Bethany laugh out loud. He saw little things that she had long stopped noticing. The way the baker always had flour on his left eyebrow, but never on his right one. How the banker's wife kept wearing bigger and fancier hats, as if she were trying to compete with the church steeple. They were just passing the hotel when Thomas and Elena stepped out, and Bethany felt her back go rigid without even thinking about it. But Quinn's hand found hers, his fingers warm and rough as they wrapped around her own, and that simple touch gave her a burst of strength. "Miss Zimmerman, Mr. Dalton," Elena called out, sounding genuinely pleased. "What a beautiful morning for a stroll." "It surely is," Quinn agreed in a friendly voice, keeping a firm hold of Bethany's hand. "Are you two getting settled in, okay?" "Oh, yes, the hotel is perfectly fine," Thomas said, but his tone made it sound like it was far below his usual standards. His gaze fell to where Quinn and Bethany's hands were linked, and a strange look passed over his face. "Though I have to admit, I am still getting used to being back in a frontier town after living in sophisticated San Francisco." "Oregon City has its own kind of charm," Bethany said, lifting her chin up just a little. "Not everyone needs big city sophistication to be happy." "Of course not," Thomas agreed right away, though his smile was condescending. "I only meant that it must be a big change for you since you have never left here. You always did have such simple tastes." His words were designed to sting, to remind her that she was just a small-town girl and unsophisticated compared to his worldly new wife. But before the hurt could truly take hold, Quinn's thumb gently stroked the back of her hand, a silent reminder that she was not by herself anymore. "I have always believed that the best things in life are usually the simple ones," Quinn said. His voice was casual, but his eyes were like flint as he looked straight at Thomas. "Good land, honest work, and people who keep their promises, that sort of thing. Fancy cities are fine for a visit, I suppose, but I would not want to live in a place that made me forget what is truly important." The criticism was subtle, but it was sharp, and a hint of red crept up Thomas's neck. Elena, on the other hand, seemed entertained by it all, her clever eyes looking at Quinn with a new kind of interest. "Well, what a refreshing point of view," she said with warmth. "Thomas, we really should let these two get on with their walk. We have that meeting with Mr. Fredericks about the warehouse space." Thomas let her lead him away, but not before he shot one last puzzled look back at Bethany, as if he just could not understand how his former fiancé had found a woman just like Quinn Dalton once they were out of listening range. Bethany let out a long, slow breath. "He always knew the right thing to say to make me feel small." "Well then, he is either mean or he is a fool," Quinn said, plain as day. "Probably a bit of both. There is not a thing small about you, Bethany. You have your own business. You look after yourself. You built a whole new life after he nearly tore yours down. That takes a kind of strength most folks just do not have." Bethany felt her eyes welling up for the second time in as many days. But this was different from the soul-crushing tears she cried when Thomas first took off. This felt more like a weight being lifted, like someone was finally saying the words she had been needing to hear for 3 long years. "Thank you," she whispered. "You hardly know me, but it seems you understand things better than people I have known my entire life." "Sometimes a little distance makes things clearer," Quinn said softly. "And sometimes you just see something in another person because you have walked a similar road yourself." "Has your heart been broken before?" Bethany asked, her curiosity now truly sparked. Quinn was silent for a spell, his gaze turning inward. "Not by a woman," he finally said. "But I sure know what it feels like to be left behind, to be made to feel like you just were not good enough. My own father made certain I understood that loud and clear before I left home at 16. The simple way he said it could not cover up the old hurt underneath, and Bethany squeezed his hand before she even thought about it. I am so sorry. A parent should never make their child feel like that. That is just water under the bridge now, Quinn said, though the way he squeezed her hand back told her the sympathy was not unwelcome. The point is, I get what you are going through, and I am more than happy to make sure that fool and his new wife do not make you feel that way ever again. They kept walking, and their clasped hands felt more and more right with every step. By the time Quinn led her back to her shop, Bethany realized she had actually had a good time, and for long moments she had forgotten this was all supposed to be a performance. That became their routine over the next week, Quinn would stop by the shop every morning and they would take a walk, sometimes to run errands, other times just to talk. They ran into Thomas and Eleanor 2 more times, and on each occasion having Quinn there made it all manageable. His quiet strength gave Bethany the courage she needed to hold her head high. But something else was starting to happen, something neither of them had seen coming. Their talk started going deeper, getting more personal. Quinn told her about his childhood on a failing ranch down in Texas, about a father who drank more than he should and blamed his own boys for his shortcomings. He talked about leaving home with nothing more than a horse and the shirt on his back. Bethany opened up too, telling him stories about her mother passing when she was just 10, about how she had to care for her grieving father, and about the deep loneliness she felt watching her friends get married and start their own families while she just buried herself in her work. Soon, Quinn was staying for lunch and then for dinner. Bethany found out he was good with his hands, and before long he was fixing the loose floorboard on her stairs, the squeaking hinge on her front door, and the window that never would shut quite right. He never asked for a dime, but she made him meals that got fancier each time, realizing she loved cooking for a man who truly appreciated it. The folks in Oregon City started to see them as a real couple, and neither Bethany nor Quinn ever said otherwise. Mrs. Henderson would give them a knowing smile any time she saw them out together. Mr. Chen at the restaurant started giving Bethany an extra portion of dumplings, enough for 2. Even the deputy marshal, who had been a little wary of the quiet newcomer at first, began to give Quinn a respectful nod when he passed by. It was almost 2 weeks into their little arrangement when everything took a turn. Bethany was closing up her shop for the evening when she heard loud voices coming from outside. She stepped onto the boardwalk and saw Quinn squared off with 2 fellas she knew from the lumber mill. Both of them were clearly deep in their cups and spoiling for a fight. "You think you are something special, don't you?" one of them slurred, swaying on his feet. "Just strolling into our town, taking the prettiest girl for yourself. What makes you so much better than the rest of us?" "I am not looking for any trouble," Quinn said, his voice calm and even. His hands were down at his sides, but his body was coiled up and ready. "Why do not you boys just go sleep it off?" "Maybe we do not want to," the second man snarled. "Maybe we want to teach you some manners about moving in on our town's women." Bethany's heart was hammering in her chest, but she made herself step forward. "Leave him be, Ben. You have both had more than enough to drink." "You stay out of this, Bethany," Ben shot back, barely giving her a look. "This is between men." "There is nothing between anyone," Quinn said, his voice firm. "Go home, sleep it off. By tomorrow this will all seem mighty foolish." But Ben was already throwing a punch, his fist swinging toward Quinn's face with a drunk man's clumsiness. Quinn moved aside like it was nothing, not even trying to hit back, just letting Ben's own momentum send him stumbling. The other man tried to grab Quinn from behind, but Quinn just twisted out of his grip, still refusing to fight. "I said, I'm not looking for trouble." "Or," Quinn repeated, his voice getting harder, "do not make me defend myself." Just then, the deputy marshal came running down the street, drawn by all the noise. In just a few minutes, he had the 2 drunk men under control, apologizing to Quinn and promising they would be spending the night in a cell to cool their heads. After they were gone, Bethany turned to Quinn, her eyes wide. "You could have hit them. You could have ended that in a heartbeat. Why did you not fight back?" "Because fighting ought to be the last thing you do, not the first," Quinn said simply. "And because I did not want you to see me like that. I did not want you to think I was a violent man." That admission was so raw and honest it hit Bethany right in the heart. He cared what she thought of him. This was not just a show anymore, not just him doing a favor for a woman in a tight spot. Somewhere down the line, this had all become real. "Quinn," she began, not even sure what she wanted to say, just knowing she had to say something. "I should probably go," he cut in, his voice a little rough. "Make sure those fellas did not stir up anything else." He was gone before she could answer, leaving Bethany standing alone on the boardwalk, her heart pounding and her head spinning. Everything was different now. She did not know exactly when or how it had happened, but she knew for certain that what she felt for Quinn Dalton was no longer pretend. She did not see him at all the next day. He did not come by the shop that morning, and when she walked by the boarding house where he was staying, Mrs. Henderson told her he had headed out before the sun was up and had not come back. Bethany tried to work, but her mind kept wandering, playing back every conversation, every touch, and every single moment they had shared. It was getting late in the afternoon when the bell on her shop door finally rang. But it was not Quinn. It was Thomas Whitmore who walked inside. Bethany stood up straight from the dress she was hemming, a wave of surprise and exhaustion washing over her. "Thomas, where is Eleanor? She is resting back at the hotel. She has not been feeling her best." Thomas took off his hat, wringing the brim in his hands. It was a nervous habit she remembered from when they were courting. "I wanted a word with you alone, Bethany. I think it is time we cleared the air." "I do not believe we have anything left to talk about," Bethany said, her voice measured as she set down her sewing needle. "Oh, I think we do." Thomas walked farther into her shop, his face looking earnest. "I have been watching you these past 2 weeks with that cowboy, and it got me to thinking about the past, about us, about the terrible mistake I made." Bethany's stomach felt like it dropped to the floor. "Thomas, please do not." "I never should have left you," he said, the words tumbling out of him. "I was young and foolish and thought I needed some grand adventure, thought I needed to see the world. But all I found out there was that success does not mean a thing if you do not have the right person by your side." "You have Eleanor by your side," Bethany pointed out, her voice turning to ice. "Your wife." "Eleanor is a fine woman, but she is not you," Thomas said, taking another step toward her. "She does not understand me like you did. She does not know my history, my home. These last few weeks, seeing you again, remembering everything we had, I cannot stop thinking that I made the biggest mistake of my entire life when I walked away." "You need to stop talking," Bethany said, her voice sharp as attack, as anger flared up hot and fast inside her. "You do not get to do this. You do not get to just stroll back into my life with your pretty wife and your successful business and tell me you made a mistake. You are about 3 years too late for that." "I know I hurt you," Thomas started to say. "You did not hurt me. You shattered me," Bethany cut him off, her voice starting to tremble. "You broke off our engagement 2 weeks before our wedding day. You humiliated me in front of this whole town and left me here to pick up all the broken pieces by myself. I spent months where I could not even leave my own house without seeing people look at me with pity. I had to build my entire life over from scratch. And you think you can just come in here and say you are sorry? And I will do what? Fall right back into your arms?" "I thought perhaps we could start over," Thomas said, his voice weak, clearly taken aback by her fire. "If you still have feelings—" "I do have feelings. For someone else," Bethany said with absolute conviction. And as the words left her mouth, she knew they were the truest things she had ever said. "Quinn is twice the man you will ever be. He is honest, and he is kind, and he shows up when he says he's going to. He does not go around making promises he has no intention of keeping, and he sure does not leave people behind. So no, Thomas, we cannot start over. We are done. We have been done for 3 long years." His face was a mix of red-hot anger and shame. "You are picking that drifter over me. Bethany, I am giving you the chance at a good life, not some make-believe story with a horseman who will likely be gone by next month." "Get out of my shop," Bethany said, her voice as calm and cold as a winter morning. "Now. And do not ever come back. Whatever business you have here in Oregon City, you best finish it up and move on. I do not want to lay eyes on you again." "You are making a big mistake," Thomas said, inching his way to the door. "You are going to regret this." "The only thing I regret is ever saying yes to your proposal," Bethany answered right back. "Now get out." Thomas stormed out, letting the door slam shut behind him, and Bethany just collapsed into her chair, trembling from the power of the words she had finally spoken. But under all that anger and surprise, she felt a lightness she had not known in years. She had finally let it all out, had finally spoken up for herself instead of just taking whatever life handed her. And she knew with absolute certainty that she was in love with Quinn Dalton. The shop door creaked open again, and Bethany's head shot up, ready to give Thomas another piece of her mind if he had the nerve to return. But it was Quinn standing there in the doorway, and his face looked like a brewing storm. "I was just across the street," he said, getting straight to the point. "I saw that Whitmore fellow come in here. Are you okay? Did he put his hands on you?" "Not in that way," Bethany said, and her heart soared just looking at him. "He came to tell me he was wrong for leaving me, that he should have married me instead of Eleanor." Quinn's jaw went tight. "And what did you tell him?" "I told him he was 3 years too late and that he needed to leave my shop," Bethany said, getting to her feet and walking toward Quinn. "I let him know I had feelings for someone else." A flicker of something crossed Quinn's eyes. It was a mixture of hope and fear and a deep wanting. "Do you really have feelings for another man?" "Yes," Bethany said plainly, stopping just inches from him. "I have feelings for you, Quinn. Real feelings, not the pretending kind. And I reckon I have for a good while now, but I was just too afraid to say it out loud." Quinn just looked at her for what felt like a lifetime. Bethany's heart was beating so fast she thought it might just bust right out of her chest. Then he lifted his hand, cupping her cheek with a gentleness she could hardly believe, his thumb softly tracing her cheekbone. "I came back to tell you that I cannot keep this up," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I was leaving town because pretending to be your suitor when I wanted the real thing was just tearing me apart. But Bethany, if you mean what I think you mean—" "I am saying I am done with pretending," Bethany whispered, leaning into his hand. "I am saying I want this to be real. I am saying that I am falling in love with you." A low sound rumbled in Quinn's throat, and then his mouth was on hers. His lips were warm and sure against her own, and his hands held her face like she was the most precious thing in the world. Bethany's hands grabbed onto his vest, pulling him even closer, and she poured 3 long years of loneliness and wanting into that kiss. When they finally pulled apart, both of them breathing hard, Quinn rested his forehead on hers. "I love you," he said with a fierce certainty. "I have loved you since that first week when you were telling me about your books, and your eyes got that faraway, dreamy look. I kept telling myself this was just a deal, that I was just helping you, but I was just lying to myself the whole time." "Well, then we are both a couple of fools," Bethany said, laughing a little as tears started to stream down her face. "Falling in love while we were supposed to be faking it. The best kind of fools there are," Quinn agreed, and he kissed her again, slower this time, but with just as much meaning. They just stood there inside her shop, holding on to each other as the daylight outside faded into twilight, and Bethany felt a sense of peace settle deep inside her. This was it. This was what had been missing with Thomas. This feeling of being just right, of 2 souls fitting together in every way that truly counted. "So, what comes next?" she finally asked, not wanting to pull away but needing to see his face. "Next, I stop staying at that boarding house and I start looking for a piece of land," Quinn said with resolve. "I am going to build that ranch I have always dreamed of. I want to put down some real roots here in Oregon City. And I want you right there with me, if you will have me." "That almost sounds like you are proposing, Mr. Dalton," Bethany said, a smile spreading across her lips. "Not quite yet," Quinn said, his expression turning serious. "When I ask for your hand, it is going to be done proper, with a ring and everything a woman like you deserves. But I am telling you that is the road I am on, the one I hope we are on together. I want to marry you, Bethany. I want to build a whole life with you." "I want that too," Bethany said, as a fresh wave of happy tears spilled over. "I want every bit of that with you." By the next morning, the whole town of Oregon City knew that Quinn Dalton and Bethany Zimmerman were officially and truly courting. Not that most folks ever thought it was pretend to begin with. Mrs. Henderson was tickled pink, saying she knew from the very start they were made for each other. Mr. Chen gave them so many free dumplings that they had to share with half the town. Thomas and Eleanor left Oregon City 3 days later. It seemed Thomas finished his business a lot quicker than he had planned. Bethany watched their stagecoach roll away from her shop window, with Quinn's arms wrapped tight around her waist from behind, and she felt nothing at all. That part of her life was over for good, and she was more than ready for the new one to start. Quinn was a man of his word about finding land. He had saved up more money during his wandering years than Bethany ever imagined, and in less than a month he owned 200 acres right outside of town. It was good grazing land with a creek cutting through it, and a nice little stand of trees that would be the perfect spot for a house. "It is not much to look at right now," he told her as they stood on the property on a cool October afternoon, "but I can see exactly what it is going to be. A house right there by the trees, a barn and stables a little closer to the road, and pastures for the horses and cattle. It will take years to get it all done, but I am going to do it right." "It sounds absolutely perfect," Bethany said, seeing the whole picture right along with him. "Can I help? I'm not very good with building, but I could—" "You could live there with me," Quinn cut in, turning to look her straight in the eye. "As my wife." He took a small box out of his pocket and opened it to show a simple gold ring with one small diamond. "It is not all that fancy," he said, looking a little nervous all of a sudden. "But Bethany Zimmerman, you are the strongest, bravest, and most wonderful woman I have ever known. You make me want to be a better man, to build something that will last, to put down roots and never roam again. Will you marry me?" "Yes," Bethany said without a moment's hesitation. "Yes, of course, yes." Quinn slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit just right, like it had been made for her all along. Then he was kissing her again, sweeping her right off her feet and spinning her around as she laughed with pure, unbridled joy. They got married in early December at the little church, and it felt like half of Oregon City was there to see it. Bethany wore a gown she had made, herself, plain but lovely, and Quinn was in his best suit with his hair all trimmed neat. The deputy marshal stood as his best man, and Mrs. Henderson cried all the way through the service. They spent the winter months living in Bethany's little apartment above the shop, while Quinn got to work building their home. He hired on some help from town, and Bethany would close her shop 3 days a week to go out and help in any way she could. She learned how to hammer a nail straight, how to measure a piece of wood, and how to think about foundations and supports. Quinn was always patient with her, teaching her things with that same gentle way he had with his horses. By the time spring rolled around, the house was done. It was a handsome 2-story home with big windows to catch the morning sun and a porch that wrapped around 3 whole sides. They moved in on the first warm day of May, hauling their furniture and all their belongings out to their new life together. Bethany kept her seamstress shop going, riding into town 3 days a week while Quinn worked on the ranch. He bought his first string of horses that summer. They were magnificent animals that he trained with a gentle hand and real skill, and word of his talent as a horse trainer traveled fast. Within a year, ranchers were coming from all over the Oregon Territory just to buy one of Quinn Dalton's horses. Their life settled into a nice, easy rhythm. It was full of hard work, but that was balanced by peaceful evenings spent on their porch, just watching the sun go down over their land. They would talk about everything under the sun, sharing their dreams and their worries, and just the small things they noticed during the day. Quinn taught Bethany how to ride a horse, and she taught him how to dance, and they would practice right there in their kitchen while she hummed the songs. It was in the autumn of 1878, almost 2 years after that unforgettable day on Main Street, that Bethany figured out she was pregnant. She had had a feeling for a few weeks, but she wanted to be sure before she said anything to Quinn. When she finally told him, as they sat on their porch with the evening sun turning everything to gold, he got so quiet she thought for a second he had not heard her. "Quinn," she said, a little unsure. "Did you hear me?" He turned to look at her, and there were tears in his eyes. He pulled her into a hug so carefully it was like she was made of fine china. "A baby," he whispered into her hair. "We are going to have a baby." "Are you happy about it?" Bethany asked, even though she could feel the answer in the way he was holding her. "Happy is not a big enough word for this," Quinn said, his voice a little rough. "Bethany, you have given me every single thing I never even knew I was missing. A home, a family, a reason to get up every morning feeling thankful, and now this, a child." I just do not have the words for how I feel right now." Their son came into the world in May of 1879, born on a warm spring morning after a long night. Quinn paced the floor downstairs while Mrs. Henderson and the midwife were with Bethany, pacing a hole in their new floorboards. The moment he heard that first cry, he shot up the stairs, his eyes wide as he burst into the bedroom. "It is a boy," Mrs. Henderson announced with a proud smile, setting the little fella in Bethy's arms. "He is healthy and strong, and from the sound of him, he has got his daddy's lungs." Quinn just collapsed onto the bed next to Bethany, gazing at their son in pure awe. The baby had Quinn's dark hair and Bethy's green eyes, and he was just the most perfect thing they had ever seen. "What are we going to name him?" Bethany whispered, gently touching the baby's soft cheek. "James," Quinn said after a moment, "for your father. He would have been so proud. He would have loved seeing you this happy." Tears welled up in Bethy's eyes. "James Dalton. That is perfect." James was a cheerful baby who turned into a curious toddler, running his parents ragged. Quinn took to being a father like a duck to water. He was patient and full of fun, teaching his boy all about horses and cattle with a joy that never faded. Bethany would watch the two of them and feel a love so big she did not know a heart could hold it. 2 years later, their little girl came along, born right in the middle of a big summer thunderstorm. They called her Rose, and she had Quinn's warm, honey-colored eyes and Bethy's stubborn streak. While James was the careful and quiet one, Rose was a little spitfire, climbing on everything in sight and stirring up trouble wherever she went. The ranch did better than they had ever hoped. Quinn's good name brought in steady work, and soon they bought more land, added on to the house, and hired some hands to help out. Bethany finally sold her dressmaking shop to a nice young woman who had just moved out from the east. She kept a few of her favorite customers and worked from home, which gave her more time with the children. Oregon City was growing right along with them, changing from a rough-and-tumble frontier town into a real community. New folks moved in, businesses grew, and things started to feel more settled. Through it all, Quinn and Bethany became well-known folks in town, respected for their honesty, their open door, and the deep love they clearly had for each other. Every now and then, Bethany would remember that awful day she stood frozen on the street, watching Thomas show up with his new wife, feeling like her whole world had just crumbled. She never laid eyes on Thomas again after he left town. She did hear through the grapevine, though, that his marriage went sour, his business went under, and he just wandered from one place to another, chasing a success that was always just out of his reach. She did not feel happy about his misfortune, but she sure felt thankful for the road her own life had taken. If Thomas had not stomped on her heart, if he had not appeared that day in Oregon City, she might never have met Quinn. She might have gone her whole life without knowing what true love felt like, or what it was like to build a life with a real partner who stood by you in every single way. For their 10th wedding anniversary, Quinn planned a surprise trip. He got Mrs. Henderson to look after the kids for a couple of days, and took Bethany high up into the mountains to a stunning lake surrounded by fields of wildflowers. They spent 3 days camping, just talking and laughing and being close under the stars, feeling like a couple of young kids in love again instead of parents to 2 wild children. "Do you ever regret it?" Quinn asked one night as they sat by the fire with Bethany snuggled up against his side, settling for a simple horse rancher instead of a man with better prospects. Settling. Bethany pushed herself up and looked at him like he had lost his mind. "Quinn Dalton, calling you settling is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. You are more than everything I was ever brave enough to dream of." "Good," Quinn said, pulling her in even tighter, "because you are stuck with me for the long haul." "Forever sounds just right to me," Bethany whispered back, giving him a soft kiss. They came home to the sound of their children squealing with delight. James and Rose nearly knocked them over, both talking at once about all the things that happened while they were away. That night, long after the kids were tucked in bed, Quinn and Bethany stood on the porch, looking out at their land with their hands clasped together. "Do you remember when all this was just a patch of dirt and a prayer?" Quinn asked softly. I remember being scared and completely heartbroken. And then you showed up to rescue me, Bethany answered, giving his hand a squeeze. I did not rescue you, Quinn said in his gentle way. You rescued yourself. I just made sure you did not have to go through it all alone. We rescued each other, Bethany said, feeling sure of it, and we built something pretty wonderful together. The years kept rolling by, as they always do, filled with little moments of happiness and the occasional sadness. The children grew up, the ranch got bigger, and the love between them deepened, a love that came from choosing one another day after day. James grew into a fine young man who loved the horses just as much as his father did, while Rose became such a good rider she could outshoot most of the ranch hands before she was even 12. In 1890, when Bethany was 37 and Quinn was 39, they were surprised with a third child, another boy they named Daniel. He was a wonderful surprise, welcomed with open arms by the entire family. James and Rose just adored their new baby brother, watching over him like little hawks. Quinn's hair started to show some gray at the sides, and little laugh lines formed around Bethy's eyes, but they still looked at each other like they were brand new. They still danced around the kitchen, still sat on the porch and talked for hours, and still found each other in the dark of the night, like two compasses pointing home. The ranch became famous all over the Oregon Territory as one of the best horse outfits around. Rich folks would come all the way from California to buy one of Quinn Dalton's expertly trained horses. But all that success never changed the man Quinn was. He was still steady, honest, and completely devoted to his family above anything else. Bethany published her first book in 1895. It was a collection of stories about life on the frontier that took everyone by surprise, most of all herself. She had just started jotting down little things in the evenings after the kids were asleep, just small memories and thoughts. But Quinn had pushed her to turn them into something more. A publisher up in Portland decided to take a chance on it, and just like that, Bethany Dalton was not only a rancher's wife, but a real author. Well, look at you, Quinn said, his voice thick with pride when the first printed book arrived. He held her tight while she cried happy tears. You always craved adventures, and now you get to share them with the whole world. You are my greatest adventure, Bethany told him, and she meant it with every part of her soul. By the time the new century rolled around, James was running most of the day-to-day work on the ranch. He was a responsible 21-year-old who had his father's touch with horses and his mother's sharp mind for business. Rose had stunned them all by declaring she was going to be a doctor, and she headed back east to medical school, with her parents' full blessing and support. Daniel, who was now 10 years old, was still figuring out who he wanted to become, trying on different dreams to see which one felt right. Quinn and Bethany were in their mid-40s by then, their faces and hands showing the story of their hard work and their hard-won joy. They had made it through droughts and tough winters, through sick kids and difficult birthing seasons, all the usual trials that come with making a life in a place that was still a little wild. But they had faced every single bit of it together, and that was what truly mattered. One warm evening in the summer of 1901, 25 years after that life-changing day on Main Street, they sat on their porch. They watched the setting sun paint the sky with streaks of orange and pink. Their grandchildren were playing down in the yard. James had married a lovely girl named Catherine 2 years before, and they had a little boy and a brand-new baby girl. Even Rose was home visiting, taking a break from her medical books to be with her family. Do you recall how scared I was to face Thomas and Eleanor by myself? Bethany asked, resting her head on Quinn's shoulder. I just remember thinking you were the prettiest woman I had ever laid eyes on, even when you looked like you wanted the ground to swallow you whole, Quinn answered, his arm wrapped tight around her waist. I was so sure that my life was over, Bethany said quietly. Seeing him standing there with his new wife felt like the worst thing that could ever happen to me. And it turned out to be the best thing, Quinn said, leaning over to kiss her forehead. Because it led me right to you. It led us to each other, Bethany corrected him, turning her head to give him a proper kiss. Every good thing in my life began on that day, when a kind cowboy made sure I did not have to face my old flame all alone. I would do it all over again in a heartbeat, Quinn told her. I would do anything in the world for you, Bethany. Back then, right now, and for all our days to come. I know, she said softly, reaching up to gently touch his weathered cheek. And that is what makes this life so special. It is built on real love, a real partnership, and a true commitment, not on the kind of empty promises Thomas used to make. They sat there together as the sun finally disappeared, casting long golden shadows across their world. The sound of their children and grandchildren's laughter floated up from the yard, the sweet music of the life they had built from scratch. The ranch stretched out all around them, thriving and beautiful, a living testament to their dreams. Bethany Zimmerman, the girl who was once left shamed and with a broken heart, had found something so much better than the life she had once planned. She had found Quinn Dalton, a cowboy with a good heart and steady hands, who showed up right when she needed someone the most. They had built more than just a ranch together. They had built a legacy. It was forged from hard work and honest love, and children raised to be decent human beings. Theirs was a partnership that had faced down every storm that came their way. And each evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip low, Bethany would offer a quiet prayer of thanks for the day her old fiancé appeared with his new wife. That painful day had unknowingly led her to Quinn. It had brought her to her true home and gifted her a life far more wonderful than any adventure she had ever imagined from a book. She leaned into Quinn's strong embrace, the steady beat of his heart a comfort against her back. She knew with a certainty that ran bone deep that this was precisely where she was meant to be. This wasn't about settling or compromising. It was about finding the one soul in the world who saw her for everything she was and loved her just the same, the man who had stood by her side for 25 years. And she knew he would stand there for however many more years they were blessed with. "I love you," she whispered, and the words were as true today as when she first said them in her shop all that time ago. "I love you too," Quinn answered, his voice full of deep emotion. "Always have, always will." As the first stars began to prick the darkening canvas of the sky above their ranch, Bethany smiled. She let herself settle into the profound peace of knowing she was exactly where she belonged, with the exact person she belonged with. She was living a life that was worth every single moment of heartache it had taken to find it.